You think you know ancient Egypt pharaohs in gold, queens draped in silk, temples shimmering in the sun. But what if I told you the same civilization that built the pyramids also practiced sexual rituals so graphic, so taboo, that modern historians still debate whether to even publish them? Here's the sickest twist. Incest wasn't a scandal, it was royal policy. Priests performed fertility rites that crossed every line of morality. And public festivals? They turned entire cities into arenas of lust. But wait, it gets worse. These acts weren't hidden, they were etched into stone, blessed by the gods, and celebrated for all to see. In ancient Egypt, power wasn't just inherited, it was bred, and that meant keeping the royal blood as pure as the gold in the pharaoh's tomb. How? By marrying your sister, sometimes your half-sister, sometimes even your own daughter. But wait, it gets worse. This wasn't a dirty secret whispered behind palace doors, it was written into royal decrees, carved into stone for eternity. The gods, they claimed, had set the example. Osiris married his sister Isis. So if a pharaoh took his sister to bed, it wasn't a scandal, it was divine tradition. The logic was twisted but absolute. The throne could only be held by someone of pure, undiluted royal blood. That meant your pool of acceptable partners was so small, you could count them on one hand. And yes, sometimes that hand was part of your own family tree. Here's the sickest twist. The children of these unions weren't spared. They were raised knowing they'd be expected to do the same. But this sacred incest wasn't just about politics, it was about control. By keeping marriage within the family, you kept power from slipping into the hands of rival dynasties. And it gave the ruling family an almost godlike status. After all, if you were born of a brother and sister who were also king and queen, you weren't just human, you were divine flesh. Of course, reality wasn't so glorious. Inbreeding led to genetic deformities, frail health, and shortened lifespans. But in Egypt, the image mattered more than the truth. As long as the carvings showed perfect godlike rulers, no one spoke of the weaknesses behind the palace walls. And yet, what happened in those royal chambers was only the beginning of Egypt's most disturbing sexual customs. The royal bedrooms weren't the only place where ancient Egypt's sexual customs would turn your stomach. Inside the temples, the priests had their own rituals, and some of them make royal incest look tame. The most infamous? Something historians call the god's seed ritual. It wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't just a myth acted out in costume. This was a ritual where the line between religion and raw exploitation didn't just blur, it disappeared. It all came from the legend of Osiris and Isis. You probably know the short version. Osiris murdered, chopped into pieces, and scattered across Egypt by his jealous brother Set. His sister wife Isis searched for every part of him, except one. His phallus, they said, had been tossed into the Nile and devoured by fish. So Isis carved a replacement, brought Osiris back to life just long enough to conceive their son Horus, and in doing so, ensured Egypt's divine bloodline. But wait, it gets worse. To the priests, this wasn't just a story, it was an instruction manual. In certain fertility festivals, the high priest would literally play the part of the god, and an Isis figure, often a hand-picked young woman from the elite families, would unite with him in a reenactment designed to bless the Nile's floods. Sometimes this was staged with symbolism, sometimes it wasn't. Here's the sickest twist. Greek chroniclers like Herodotus claimed these unions were not hidden away. They could be witnessed, in some form, by the people gathered outside the temple, the beating of drums, the chanting of hundreds of priests, the overwhelming smoke of incense masking everything but the spectacle itself. And if the Nile didn't flood that year, the blame fell on the chosen woman. Imagine being 16 years old, told the survival of your kingdom depended on how convincingly you could please a man in front of the gods. The pressure wasn't just spiritual. Fail, and famine was your fault. Fail, and you could be exiled from court in disgrace, or sent into permanent temple isolation, your name erased from records. Succeed, and your blessing was paraded as proof of divine favor, even if you never wanted to be there in the first place. And yes, it gets even darker. Some girls didn't even choose to be there. They were raised in temple schools, groomed from childhood to become divine vessels for this single moment. Their entire upbringing was about one night, one ritual, one act, after which they could be discarded, married off to an old priest, or confined behind temple walls for the rest of their lives. And for the crowd outside, it wasn't a moment of shame, it was celebration. Offerings were thrown, chants rose to a fever pitch, and the climax of the ritual was announced with the slamming open of the temple doors. Priests emerged, holding sacred offerings that symbolized the god's seed, placing them on the altar for all to see. In the storybooks, this was divine magic. In reality, it was a system built on coercion, humiliation, and the absolute power of a priesthood that could rewrite morality at will. But the god's seed was nothing compared to the next ritual, where sex was just the first step and blood was the second. If the god's seed ritual made your skin crawl, this next one will make you wonder how ancient Egypt didn't just collapse under the weight of its own madness. Because here, sex was only the warm-up act, the real climax came in blood. The blood and seed ceremony was tied to the cult of Hathor and Set, and it was designed to merge the life force of man with the strength of the gods. Sounds poetic, right? It wasn't. It was brutal. First came the union, just like the god's seed ritual. A high priest, or sometimes even the pharaoh himself, would take the role of the god, with a chosen divine consort acting as his goddess. But instead of ending there, the act had a violent twist that was believed to seal the blessing. But wait, it gets worse. Once the union was complete, blood had to be offered alongside the seed. And not just any blood, it had to be taken from the participants themselves. In some accounts, it was a cut to the palm or the chest. In darker accounts, it was far more intimate. Priests believed that blood taken closest to the act of creation was the most powerful, and that meant wounds in places most people would never dare imagine. Here's the sickest twist. This wasn't performed in secret, shadowed chambers. The crowd, often hundreds deep, would be waiting for the moment when the temple doors opened, and the high priest emerged, holding a bowl containing a mixture of wine, herbs, and the combined fluids of the ritual. That bowl would be placed on the altar, sometimes even poured into the Nile as an offering, while chants filled the air like a war cry. If you think that's disturbing, picture this. Some participants didn't survive the ritual. Infection, blood loss, and even deliberate sacrifice were part of the ceremony's unspoken risks. Ancient Egyptian medical knowledge was advanced for its time, but in a pre-antibiotic world, a wound in the wrong place could mean a slow, agonizing death. And yet, the ritual went on for centuries because the people believed that if the gods were not fed both life forces, disaster would follow. And yes, it gets even darker. There are records suggesting that during certain dynasties, the blood and seed ceremony was done with more than two people. Multiple divine consorts were chosen, lined up, and taken one after the other by the priest or pharaoh, with each union followed by its own bloodletting. The fluids from all participants were collected into the same bowl, a communal gift to the gods. The smell alone must have been horrific, a mix of iron and sweat and incense, heavy enough to choke on. Witnesses, often standing outside the temple but close enough to hear, described the sound of drumming growing louder and faster during the act, peaking at the moment of bloodletting. It wasn't just ritual, it was performance, designed to work the crowd into a fever pitch. And when the temple doors finally slammed shut again, the silence would be absolute, as if the entire city held its breath. Those chosen for the ritual didn't get to refuse. Women were taken from noble houses, trained in temple etiquette, and kept under guard until the night of the ceremony. Some were told it was the greatest honor of their lives. Others knew it was a death sentence. And for the priests, it was absolute power. You could condemn or bless a family for generations by deciding whose daughter would serve as Hathor. The aftermath was equally twisted. Survivors were often secluded for days, fed only certain purifying foods, and bathed in oils to seal the blessing into their skin. But for some, the wounds never healed, both physical and psychological. There are accounts of women refusing to speak again after the ceremony, locked away in remote estates until their deaths. In the grand halls of the temples, the official version painted it as a sacred merging of forces, the life-giving seed and the life-sustaining blood. In reality, it was the most literal, invasive, and dehumanizing way to worship imaginable. And while the people outside celebrated the promise of fertility and strength for Egypt, those inside were left with scars that no one could see. But the blood and seed ceremony wasn't the final word in Egypt's sacred depravity. There was one more, the most secretive, most feared, where the gods themselves were said to watch from the shadows, and where the price of failure was far worse than death. If the blood and seed ceremony made you think Egypt had already hit peak depravity, strap in, because this is where things go from disturbing to absolutely nightmarish. The priests called it the Night of the Living God, and it was the ultimate test of loyalty, purity, and endurance. It was so secretive that most Egyptians didn't even know it existed. Those who did, they spoke of it only in whispers, and only behind closed doors. Here's how it worked. Once a generation, the high priests would invite a small, hand-picked group of women into the innermost temple. These weren't just anyone, they were considered the most physically perfect in the land, chosen for symmetry, youth, and health. But wait, it gets worse. The women had no choice in the matter. Refusal meant not just death, but disgrace for your entire family. The moment you were chosen, your life as you knew it was over. The name Night of the Living God came from the belief that on this one night, a deity would literally inhabit the body of the pharaoh or the high priest, if the pharaoh was too old or infirm to perform divine acts on earth. That possession was said to turn the man into a physical embodiment of the god, with an appetite and strength far beyond the human. And those acts always revolved around sex, but not the kind you imagine from romanticized myths. Here's the sickest twist. The ritual didn't stop at one partner. The god's hunger had to be fed until dawn, which could mean 6, 8, even 10 women brought in one after the other, and the divine union wasn't the only goal. Each act was followed by a bizarre offering. The woman's sweat, tears, and yes, sometimes even her blood collected in ceremonial bowls to be mixed with incense and burned before the altar. The smell must have been overwhelming, a choking mix of perfumed smoke and raw human scent. The temple itself became a stage for this living nightmare. Torches cast long shadows on the walls, painted with explicit scenes of gods and goddesses locked in eternal embrace. Drums and chanting filled the air, starting slow and steady before building into a deafening frenzy. The crowd outside, because yes, there was always a crowd, believed they were hearing the god's voice through the cries and the pounding rhythm. And yes, it gets even darker. The ritual wasn't just about the women. In some versions, male attendants were forced to participate too, acting as living statues or sacred witnesses. They stood naked, covered in gold paint, forbidden to move or speak, no matter what they saw. Their presence was meant to symbolize the gods watching the union, but for the attendants, it was a form of living torture. The pharaoh or priest, in his so-called god-possessed state, was fed aphrodisiacal foods between each blessing. Honey mixed with mandrake root, spiced wine laced with blue lotus hallucinogens that blurred the line between ecstasy and madness. By the time the last woman was brought in, the man was often in a trance, eyes glassy, mouth muttering the names of deities as if speaking to the other side. But here's the nightmare fuel. Not everyone survived the night. The strain on the women, emotional, physical, and often violent, could be fatal. Some collapsed mid-ritual, others in the days after from internal injuries or infection. Those who did survive were often marked for life. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to have children, forbidden to even speak of what happened. Instead, they were sent to secluded villas, living out their days as brides of the god, a poetic title for what was essentially exile. Outside the temple, the public saw only the aftermath. The high priest emerging at dawn, covered in oil and sweat, carrying the final bowl of divine essence to pour into the Nile. The crowd roared, believing Egypt had been blessed for another generation. No one dared ask what happened to the women who didn't walk out. Their names were erased from records, their families told to forget them. Some ancient texts hint at even darker variations. One suggests that during times of famine or plague, the ritual was intensified, the gods' hunger doubled to restore balance. This meant twice the number of women, twice the bloodletting, and twice the danger. Another text describes an even more sinister ending. The final woman offered to the god was sometimes killed. Her body burned in the temple to seal the blessing. Whether these accounts are literal truth or exaggerated propaganda, they paint a picture of a world where sacred duty and brutality were indistinguishable. And yet, the most chilling part isn't the ritual itself. It's that for centuries, this was celebrated as holy. Priests recorded it in glowing terms, artists painted it on temple walls, and poets compared it to the creation of the world. To them, there was no horror, only devotion. The women who endured it weren't victims in their eyes, but chosen vessels for the divine. And that's perhaps the most horrifying truth of all, that a culture so advanced, so capable of beauty and art, could normalize something so monstrously cruel. By the time the last echoes of the drums faded and the temple doors closed, Egypt had secured its blessing for another generation. But inside those sealed walls lay the bodies and the souls of those who had paid the ultimate price for a god's hunger. But this wasn't the end of Egypt's sexual horrors, because beyond the temples and the palace walls, there were rituals that didn't just take place under the eyes of the gods. They were performed for the dead themselves. And those ceremonies, they would make even the night of the living god look tame. Think Egypt's darkest ritual ended at the temple door? Not even close. Beyond those torches waited practices so grotesque, even priests whispered them. Corpses, married in midnight rites, to guarantee rebirth. Mourners hired to perform fertility pantomimes beside tombs. Here's the sickest twist. Sex wasn't just for the living, it was a contract with the dead. Amulets soaked in God's seed, linens buried damp, charms stitched where no one should stitch. But wait, it gets worse. The living paid in blood, the dead collected in silence. The stench? So unbearable it clung for days, incense, rot, and fear, yet crowds called it holy. If the night of the living god was Egypt's most blasphemous union of man and deity, this was where the line between the living and the dead dissolved entirely. In the most secret chambers of the necropolis, far from the golden sunlight of the Nile, priests carried out what they called the marriage of the Ka, and it was every bit as horrifying as it sounds. The idea was simple, or at least it seemed so to the priests. A pharaoh, noble, or wealthy patron couldn't truly enjoy the afterlife unless they entered it as a complete being. That meant wealth, food, servants, and yes, sexual fulfillment. If they had died unmarried, or if their spouse had passed before them, the priests would supply a substitute. Here's the sickest twist. That substitute wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a living person, chosen to wed the dead through an actual physical act, performed beside, and sometimes on, the embalmed body. But wait, it gets worse. The chosen bride or groom could be a slave, a servant, or even a prisoner of war. They were bathed, perfumed, and dressed in fine linen clothing that would later be buried with the corpse. Then they were led, often drugged with blue lotus and wine, into the tomb chamber. Waiting for them, the body, mummified and adorned with gold, propped up as if sitting in state. Candles flickered, incense burned thick enough to choke. The stench of preservation chemicals, natron resin, mingled with something far worse. The faint, unmistakable scent of decay that no amount of perfume could hide. The ritual began with chanting, the priest invoking the dead's Ka, their life force, to inhabit the room. The bride was expected to speak vows, words scripted centuries before promising to serve the dead for eternity. Then came the consummation. And yes, you're thinking exactly what I'm thinking. The priests claimed it was symbolic, a blessing of fertility for the afterlife, but some accounts suggest it went far beyond symbolic. In certain tombs, archaeologists have found linens that appear used, and in the margins of old funerary texts, there are notes hinting that the union had to be sealed in flesh for the magic to take hold. When the act ended, the bride wasn't free. They were considered bound to the dead forever. Some were released back into society, but under strict rules. No marriage, no children, no contact with their old life. Others, they never left the tomb. They were sacrificed, strangled, or poisoned and buried alongside the corpse as a faithful spouse. In rare cases, they were mummified too, positioned beside the original body for eternity. And here's where it gets even darker. Not all brides were adults. In some dynasties, young girls barely in their teens were chosen to marry child princes who had died before their coronation. The justification? That the prince would need a wife in the afterlife to complete his royal role. The reality? It was state-sanctioned abuse, hidden under the veil of divine duty. The psychological terror must have been unimaginable. Imagine walking into a sealed stone chamber, knowing the only company you'd ever have again was a corpse. Imagine hearing the door grind shut behind you, the light fading, the air heavy with rot. And outside, the priests told the crowd the dead had been honored, blessed, given a companion for eternity. The reality was a living nightmare for the one chosen. But wait, it still gets worse. There's evidence that in times of political unrest, these rituals were used as punishment. Speak against the pharaoh. You might find yourself bound in marriage to a corpse forced into the role of bride of the dead, as both humiliation and execution. The message was clear. Even in death, the king owned you. The strangest part? Ordinary Egyptians saw nothing wrong with it. In fact, families sometimes volunteered a daughter, believing it was an honor that would bring blessings to the household. To them, it wasn't horror, it was holy service. And that's what makes this so chilling. The cruelty was invisible to those who carried it out. By the time the last candle burned low and the final chant faded, the bride had either joined the dead in silence or emerged to live the rest of her days in exile. The priests would seal the tomb, confident they had secured the deceased's happiness in the next life. But for the living, it was a trauma that would echo until their own burial. And yet, Egypt had one more level of depravity to reveal, because not every sexual rite was meant for gods or kings. Some were designed for the masses, and they were performed in public, with no shame, under the blazing sun. What happened there would make even the marriage of the Ka look restrained. They called it the trial of the golden cup, but no one outside the harem truly understood what it meant. At first glance, it looked like a harmless celebration, an evening of wine, music, and ornate goblets brought out for the sultan's favored concubines. But wait, it gets worse. This was no ordinary party. It was an inspection, a loyalty test, and a trap, all wrapped in one. The chosen women were summoned without warning, plucked from their chambers by silent eunuchs. They were told to bring nothing but themselves, no servants, no charms, no hidden weapons. In the harem, going anywhere without your personal guard was like walking barefoot through a pit of snakes. Still, they obeyed, because refusing the summons was a death sentence in itself. The room where it happened was deceptively warm, low cushions, embroidered carpets, lamps casting a golden glow across trays of delicacies. But the warmth was a mask. The stench? So unbearable, beneath the incense, fear, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of wine laced with something more dangerous. Each woman was handed a goblet. Some were filled with rare, expensive wines. Others with a nearly identical-looking liquid that contained subtle, slow-acting poisons, doses small enough not to kill instantly, but strong enough to cause hallucinations, dizziness, and slurred speech. The Sultan and his advisors would watch closely, noting who handled the effects with grace and who faltered. If you couldn't hide your weakness here, you were deemed unfit for the greater games of palace politics. Here's the sickest twist. The poisoned goblets weren't meant to test just the women, they were a form of theater for the men behind the curtains. The viziers, generals, and foreign envoys watching in secret would place wagers on who would survive the night without vomiting, fainting, or collapsing. The fates of these women were literally gambled on like sport. The trial went beyond the drink. Once the goblets were drained, the concubines were told to perform tasks, some harmless, others humiliating while under the effects. One might be asked to recite poetry from memory. Another, to dance slowly for hours without stopping. A third, to walk across the room balancing a dagger on her palm, knowing a single slip could cost her a hand. And yes, sometimes the dagger wasn't symbolic. Some women fought the poison with sheer willpower, forcing smiles, steadying trembling hands, whispering prayers under their breath. Others tried to outwit the game, pretending to be drunker than they were so rivals would underestimate them later. But the cruelest part? There was no guarantee that surviving the night meant safety. The Sultan often took the winner into his private chamber, only for her to vanish by morning, replaced in the harem by a fresh recruit. Legends from the harem tell of one concubine, famed for her wit and beauty, who saw through the trial instantly. She swapped her goblet with the Sultan's when he wasn't looking. By the end of the night, he was the one, sweating and dizzy, humiliated before his court. She should have been executed, but the Sultan, impressed by her daring, kept her by his side for years, until she was mysteriously found dead in her bath. But wait, it gets even darker. The poisons used in the Golden Cup were often experimental. Palace alchemists concocted them from rare herbs, minerals, even ground gemstones. Some caused vivid hallucinations, visions of snakes crawling up the walls, phantom hands clutching at throats. Others mimicked the effects of madness, making the victim mutter incoherently, laugh at nothing, or cry uncontrollably in front of the court. These reactions were recorded in secret journals, studied for future use on political prisoners. To the outside world, the harem was a place of luxury silk pillows, scented baths, sweet music. But inside, nights like this revealed the truth. Beauty was just the stage set. Behind it was a laboratory of cruelty, where women were pushed to their physical and mental limits for the entertainment and strategic advantage of the men in power. By the time dawn broke after the trial of the Golden Cup, the survivors were carried back to their chambers, some barely conscious. Servants would nurse them for days, rubbing balms into swollen limbs, spoon-feeding them broth, but they never spoke of what happened, not because they didn't want to, but because the walls had ears, and the wrong word could mean the black cord around their throat before nightfall. And here's the part that turned fear into pure terror. The Golden Cup wasn't a one-time event. It was random. It could happen once a month or twice in a week. No one knew when the eunuchs would come for them again, and that uncertainty was the point. It kept every woman on edge, her body ready for poison, her mind ready for betrayal. But beyond the harem walls, another tradition brewed, one that wasn't confined to silk cushions and gold goblets. It involved the city itself, the crowds in the streets, and a public humiliation so devastating that death afterward was almost a kindness. They called it the procession of shame, and in the palace it was whispered about with the same fear people reserved for executions. But wait, this wasn't just punishment, it was a performance. When the Sultan wanted to make an example out of a concubine, whether for betrayal, rumor, or simply falling out of favor, he didn't lock her away in some dungeon. No, he sent her through the city, alive, dressed in jewels, and surrounded by guards. On the surface, it looked like a parade. In reality, it was a slow, public dismantling of her dignity. First came the dressing. The women were stripped naked in their chambers, bathed in ice water to keep them shivering, then covered in oils that made their skin glisten. They were dressed in sheer silks, so thin they might as well have been invisible. Their hair was braided with gold threads because humiliation looked better under sunlight. The goal wasn't to hide them, it was to make them a spectacle, a reminder to the people of who ruled them and how little mercy existed behind palace walls. Here's the sickest twist. This wasn't a solitary march. Other concubines were often ordered to walk alongside the condemned, pretending to support her while whispering insults in her ear. It was a way to turn friends into enemies, to plant suspicion and mistrust that lingered long after the procession ended. The route was carefully chosen. It passed markets, mosques, and public squares, places where gossip was currency. Onlookers would jeer, toss rotten fruit, shout curses. The concubine couldn't flinch. Any sign of weakness was seen as proof of guilt. And yes, guards carried whips. not to keep the crowd back, but to strike the woman if she faltered. But wait, it gets worse. The condemned wasn't just paraded for humiliation. She was often forced to confess, loudly, to crimes she may never have committed: seducing a prince, poisoning another concubine, plotting against the sultan. The words were fed to her by eunuchs walking beside her. And if she refused, the punishment shifted from public shame to immediate execution in the street. Sometimes the procession ended at the palace gates, where the woman was taken inside and never seen again. Other times, it ended at the docks, where she would be placed in a small boat with no oars and pushed into open water. To the people, it was exile. To those in the palace, it was a death sentence by another name. And the cruelest part? The harem women left behind were ordered to watch from the balconies, dressed in their finest, sipping sherbet as if it were entertainment. It sent one clear message: step out of line, and this will be you. This ritual didn't just break the woman it targeted, it poisoned the bonds between every other concubine in the palace. It made them compete harder, trust less, and sleep with one eye open. But beyond the city walls, there was a place even worse than public shame, a hidden chamber where women went in alive and came out silent forever. They called it the procession of shame. But wait, this wasn't justice, it was theater. When a concubine fell out of favor, the sultan didn't hide her away. He turned her into a warning. She was bathed in ice water, oiled until her skin gleamed, then dressed in sheer silks that revealed more than they hid. Gold-threaded braids framed her face, not to honor her, but to make humiliation beautiful. The march wound through markets and mosques, where crowds jeered and threw rotten fruit. Guards didn't protect her, they whipped her if she slowed. And yes, she was forced to confess crimes in a loud, shaking voice. Seducing princes, poisoning rivals' lines, whispered to her by eunuchs. Refusal meant an immediate execution in the street. Here's the sickest twist. Other concubines were ordered to walk beside her, pretending to comfort her while whispering venom in her ear. Friendships shattered under the weight of fear, suspicions spreading like a plague. The procession sometimes ended at the palace gates, where she vanished forever. Other times, she was sent to the docks, placed in a small boat with no oars, and pushed into the open sea. Exile in name, death in truth. And the rest of the harem? They watched from balconies, sipping sherbet, dressed in jewels, forced to smile. It wasn't entertainment, it was a threat. Step out of line, and this will be you. But the city's streets were merciful compared to what waited in the palace's hidden chamber, a place where women entered alive and left as nothing more than whispers in the dark. They called it the Room of the Three Knives. No songs, no ceremonies, just a silent hallway guarded by men who didn't speak. If a concubine was taken there, everyone knew she wouldn't be coming back. The door was made of black cedar, carved with verses meant to ward off evil. But everyone in the harem whispered that the true evil was inside. The room was lit only by a single oil lamp, casting long shadows over the floor. In the center, a low platform. On it, a silk cushion and 3 curved knives laid neatly side by side. Here's the sickest twist. The knives weren't for the executioner, they were for choice. The woman was forced to pick one, as if her selection mattered, as if the illusion of control could soften what came next. The eunuchs would bow, take the blade from her trembling hand, and then the sentence began. Sometimes it was quick, a single slash. Other times, it was drawn out. The victim forced to recite prayers as her life drained away. Her body was wrapped in the same silks she had worn in the harem, the fabrics absorbing the blood until they were unrecognizable. And yes, the rest of the harem knew. The next morning, the women would wake to find her bedding gone, her belongings burned, her name never spoken again. It was as if she had never existed. But wait, it gets worse. The silk wrappings were sometimes sent to the victim's family not as a sign of respect, but as a warning. Your daughter displeased the palace. Don't follow her example. The horror wasn't just in the death, it was in the erasure. In the harem's records, these women were simply marked with a single symbol, a crescent moon turned upside down. No name, no history, just an absence. And yet, Every woman who lived in those chambers slept knowing the room of the three knives was only ever a whisper away. One wrong look, one misunderstood word, and they could be walking down that silent hallway, never to return. Because in the hidden heart of the palace, beauty, power, and terror were woven together so tightly that no one, not even the Sultan's favorites, were truly safe.